this video we're going to go over trimming, and basically what happens when you throw is sometimes you'll have a lot of clay down at the bottom of your pot because it's been only a couple of weeks since you started throwing, so you'll really want to pay attention to trying to keep the walls as even as possible. You're going to want to put a foot on the bottom. So in Japan, they would always cut a foot into their tea bowls because they didn't want people to burn their hands. So the foot here they would hold and then they would drink. You kind of want the foot to reflect the rim and the thickness of your cylinder. So this foot trimmed by a student is kind of thick, and so is the rim. This one trimmed by me is a little bit thin, and so is the foot. Don't trim your feet too thin or else they'll crack. When we fire the kiln for a bisque, this should be about a 1/4 inch thick. I only have to do 2 hours of preheat. When it's thicker than that, I have to go up sometimes to 10 hours of preheat to boil off the excess water. So that's why it's really important that you make your object at least a 1/4 inch thick. Now, if you're making a cup, you want to go about 3/16. 3/16 would give you enough thickness where your hands aren't necessarily going to burn when you're touching your cup, but also it keeps the liquid nice and warm. Because if your wall is too thick, what it does is it draws the heat out of the liquid, and then it basically cools down the inside and makes the outside hot. This is about 1/8 of an inch thick, so that's why I put a handle, because I don't want people to burn themselves. Another benefit of making it a 1/4 inch is that it will dry faster and be ready for firing. When you're throwing, you trim as much of this bottom part off as possible. Take this tool, and at the very end, you push the clay into the side of the rib, and then you draw it up. And what that does is it cuts a lot of the clay out here. You can press it in, but that doesn't always get rid of all the clay. So what trimming does is basically make the inside and outside reflect one another. And also trim your rim so that when you get to this part, you don't have to kind of mess around too much with trying to even out things. So take care of the rim first, take care of the bottom first when you're throwing. After I throw something right, I take it off the wheel and I put it down and I let it dry. If it feels sticky, or you can actually change the shape of it, it's too wet. If this is sticky or so soft that you can easily put your finger in the bottom, that's too wet. But once it's dry enough on the rim to kind of support its own weight, like say maybe an hour later, I'll flip it over and I'll put it on its rim to dry. And then this way, this thicker piece of clay will dry out better. Because if I don't flip it over, this tends to stay really wet, and when I trim down about a 1/4 inch, it starts to collapse. And it's really important that this is dry enough so that it doesn't collapse, and it's really important that the rim isn't too dry, because when you put it on the wheel and it's too dry, meaning that it's powdery and a lot whiter than this, what's going to happen is if there's any water that touches it, it's going to crumble, and the weight of this is going to crumble the lip. So just be really careful to keep this damp. As long as it's damp, leather hard, and you can still feel with your cheek the dampness in it, and it's not powdery, then you're probably still pretty good. If it starts to go powdery, then you might run into problems with that.